Close your eyes for a moment. I want you to picture the ultimate treasure trove. Not gold, not jewels, but knowledge. Centuries of history, politics, religion, science, and secrets, all locked away behind impenetrable walls. Now, open them, because that place exists. We're not talking about a dusty university library. We are talking about the Vatican Apostolic Archive. But let's be honest, we all know its far more famous name, the Vatican Secret Archives. For hundreds of years, that name, Secret Archives, has been a magnet for every conspiracy theory imaginable. Did they bury proof of ancient alien intervention? Do they hold the lost gospel that changes everything we know about the earliest days of Christianity? What about the true fate of the Knights Templar, or perhaps the exact location of every missing Roman relic? Every whisper, every legend, leads back to those massive subterranean vaults beneath Vatican City. Now here's the reality check. The archives are a fact. 53 miles of shelving, more documents than you could read in 10 lifetimes. And for most of history, they were strictly off limits, guarded by popes and Swiss guards. But here's what most people miss. This archive is not just a record of the papacy. It's a sporadic, protected, and often reluctant museum of the ancient world. When Rome fell, when libraries burned, when invaders marched, the church became the ultimate and sometimes only safekeeper of historical documents. My goal today isn't to chase the predictable conspiracies. We're going deeper. We're going to dive into the few, rare historical fragments that scholars have been allowed to study. Pieces of ancient Roman military records, pre-medieval scientific texts, and early Christian documents that strongly suggest this place is hiding something far more profound than just papal decrees. We're talking about uncomfortable truths that could rewrite the history of the ancient world. Stay with me, because the true history is always stranger and far more valuable than the myth. All right, let's leave the world of conspiracy theories behind for a moment and look at the verifiable historical facts. To truly appreciate the secret value of the archives, you have to realize that this isn't just a storage unit for papal paperwork. It's a vast historical vacuum cleaner. Think about it. The Vatican sits on the historical epicenter of the Roman Empire. When popes started collecting and protecting documents, especially during the tumultuous centuries that saw the fall of Rome and the chaos that followed, they were doing something crucial. They were inheriting the entire historical record of one of the most powerful, complex, and bureaucratic empires the world has ever known. That means deep beneath the Basilica and the Apostolic Palace, there are layers of documents that predate the Church's dominance. It's in these pre-medieval layers, these early Latin and Greek codices, ancient handwritten books, where the truly game-changing information about the ancient world lies hidden. We're going to dive into two prime examples of what's been found, just fragments really, but fragments that change the whole picture. Let's start with the Roman military. The Roman legions were perhaps the most meticulously documented armies in history. Every man, every ration, every movement, it was all written down and archived. We know the history of nearly every major legion, except for a few key groups, particularly those stationed in the turbulent eastern provinces around Judea during the 1st century AD. Now, why is this important? This is the period immediately before and after the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, a monumental, world-changing event. Officially, the records for several major legions, especially those heavily involved in suppressing the Jewish revolt, simply disappear or are deliberately vague. The official Roman narrative suggests these legions were simply disbanded, their soldiers reassigned, their history diluted, a clean, bureaucratic end. But inside the Vatican archives, scholars have found specific fragments, old reports written on brittle papyrus and later copied into more permanent codices that tell a completely different story. These aren't just dry financial logs. They are internal military communications, sometimes written in a frantic tone. These documents detail a massive, organized internal crisis. Not just desertions, but what appears to be a religious and political mutiny within the ranks of these key legions. The papers hint at a pervasive, radical religious fervor, likely early Christian or Messianic Jewish zealotry, spreading through the Roman ranks. Think about that. Roman soldiers, the backbone of the empire, converting and turning on their masters. The fragments describe a swift, brutal, and coordinated purge, not a simple dispersal. The operation was clearly designed to wipe out the existence of these rebellious forces so thoroughly that their memory would be erased from the official Roman scrolls back in Italy. The lesson here is profound. The Vatican, by simply keeping every piece of paper that came its way, became the unintended vault for the dark secrets Rome itself sought to bury. The truth wasn't that the legions were lost, it's that they were systematically erased. And this leads us to the second, even more astonishing discovery. History mourns the destruction of the great Library of Alexandria. It's universally recognized as the greatest loss of knowledge in human history. Imagine 1,000,000 scrolls containing the peak of Hellenistic philosophy, science, and literature reduced to ashes. The narrative is always one of pure tragedy and devastating loss. But what if it was a catastrophic loss, but not a total loss? The whisper among scholars has always been that a handful of dedicated priests, philosophers, and scribes managed to smuggle out certain core, irreplaceable texts before the final fires took hold. Where did those texts go? For centuries, no one knew. It turns out, many of them made their way through the early Christian and Byzantine networks, eventually winding up in Rome. But they weren't brought as magnificent Greek originals. They came in the form of Syriac and Coptic translations. Deep inside the archives, researchers have uncovered collections of Syriac manuscripts that are stunning in their detail. These aren't the theological or liturgical works you'd expect. They are works of advanced mathematics, physics, and astronomy. The key, the piece of evidence that changes everything, is their provenance, the history of their ownership. The marginalia, the small notes written in the margins, and the introductory pages of these texts explicitly state that they were copied directly from the original scrolls of the Alexandrian library. We're talking about astronomical diagrams showing complex orbital mechanics that Europeans wouldn't officially remaster until Copernicus or Kepler over 1,000 years later. We're talking about advanced geometric theorems that predate their attribution to later Islamic or Renaissance scholars. Why is this so revolutionary? Because it proves that the knowledge was not completely destroyed. It didn't vanish and have to be painfully rediscovered from scratch. It survived. It was merely transferred, translated, and sequestered within the secure, religious walls of the Church's developing bureaucracy. The destruction of Alexandria was indeed a tragedy, but the existence of these fragments in the Vatican forces us to reframe the narrative. The knowledge of the ancient world wasn't entirely lost to history. It was simply placed in ultra-secure historical quarantine. And only now, centuries later, are we beginning to unlock that knowledge. These two case studies, the erasure of rebellious Roman legions and the rescue of Alexandrian science, clearly demonstrate that the Vatican Archives is not just a place for Pope's correspondence. It is an accidental, powerful, and deeply hidden record of the truth behind the ancient world. But this is just the story of what they kept. Next, we dive into the much more uncomfortable truths of what they did with that history. We've seen that the Vatican Archives hold the physical proof that history's biggest losses, like the Alexandrian Library, were not total, and they hold the suppressed truth behind political and military cover-ups. But the real value of this archive is not just what it preserved. It's what its contents reveal about how knowledge was controlled and how history was narrated. When you have the sole surviving copy of a text, you also hold the power to decide who sees it, when they see it, and how it fits into the established worldview. These are the uncomfortable truths, the insights that challenge the very foundation of the history we thought we knew. We are taught a neat, clean historical progression. The Roman Empire converts to Christianity and paganism is suppressed and slowly dies out. It's a clear break. But access to the archives challenges this narrative entirely. It reveals a period of intense strategic syncretism, the blending of religious practices. Scholars working in the early ecclesiastical records, letters between 4th and 5th century bishops, and official liturgical drafts have found evidence of a highly organized top-down strategy to absorb pagan festivals and rituals rather than fighting them head-on. For instance, documents discuss the careful political decision to map the birth date of Christ onto the winter solstice festivals, especially the festival of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. These weren't spontaneous cultural shifts. They were bureaucratic and religious decisions designed for one purpose: smooth conversion. Even more startling are the notes found in some early ritual books, the predecessors to modern missals. They contain detailed instructions on how to subtly adapt existing local pagan ceremonies, like harvest rituals or ancestor veneration, by simply renaming the deities or attributing the ritual power to a saint. What does this tell us? It tells us that early Christianity did not triumph over paganism by pure spiritual power alone. It used sophisticated, pragmatic, and highly political means. It didn't defeat paganism, it strategically inherited it. This insight fundamentally complicates the image of a pure early church and reveals it as a deeply political and adaptive institution right from the start. Now, let's tackle the Dark Ages. This is the period following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, typically cited as a millennium of stagnation, illiteracy, and scientific decline, before the Renaissance rediscovered classical knowledge. The Vatican Archives destroys this notion completely. As empires fell, monasteries and bishoprics became the primary centers of learning, and crucially, archiving. The knowledge didn't disappear, it simply became centralized and monopolized by the church structure. Within the archives, researchers have found hundreds of original treatises from the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, the very height of the so-called Dark Ages. These are not just copies of Aristotle, they are documents showing genuine, original innovation. Mathematics, complex calculations involving geometry and early algebra. Medicine, detailed anatomical observations and surgical practices far exceeding what was assumed possible at the time. Optics and astronomy, diagrams showing advanced understanding of light refraction and celestial mechanics, knowledge that should, theoretically, not exist until the Renaissance. These texts were written by monks and scholars across Europe, all communicating, often discreetly, through the church network. The knowledge was protected because the church recognized its power and its necessity for administration, building, and even forecasting. The archives prove that while the general European population might have lived in relative darkness, the intellectual elite within the church structure were actively advancing science. The knowledge was never lost, it was just restricted, kept in a powerful, centralized silo reserved for those deemed worthy. The Dark Ages were only dark for those outside the castle walls. Finally, the most revelatory truth. The Vatican is not just the archivist of its own history, but also the archivist of its enemies and competitors. This is accidental truth-telling at its finest. When the papacy negotiated with political powers, launched crusades, or dealt with far-flung empires, they meticulously kept not just their own letters, but the replies and reports they received. This means the archives are filled with the historical counter-narratives that official European history often ignores. Scholars have discovered Mongol Empire letters, detailed correspondence from the Mongol Khans, like Guyuk Khan, in the 13th century, often written in their own language and script, providing an unvarnished first-hand account of Mongol ambition and worldview. Ottoman administration, records from Ottoman pashas documenting taxation, land use, and governance in the Holy Land, showing local life and administration from the perspective of the Muslim authorities, not the Christian crusaders. New World reports, detailed, skeptical reports from missionaries in the Americas documenting indigenous customs and beliefs, sometimes contradicting the official triumphalist reports sent back to the Spanish crown. These documents don't just add color to history. They provide a vital balance. They show the world not just through the lens of Rome, but through the eyes of the Khan, the Sultan, and the shaman. They force us to accept that the history of Europe is inextricably linked to and defined by its interactions with these others. The overall impact of the archives is this. It reveals that history is not a clear, unified stream. It's a collection of competing narratives, and the most enduring and well-resourced institutions, like the papacy, have the power not just to write their own story, but to collect and curate the stories of everyone else. The uncomfortable truth is that the history we learn is the history that survived the archiving process. The Vatican archives show us that to find the real past, we must constantly question the narrative and always look for the evidence collected and sometimes hidden by the powerful. Next, we'll discuss what this means for the future of historical research and what you can take away from this monumental vault of truth. So we've journeyed through 53 miles of locked-down history. We've seen forgotten Roman purges, rescued Greek science, and uncovered the subtle political strategies that shaped early Christianity. What does this monumental, often contradictory collection of historical evidence mean for us today? What is the profound takeaway from the Vatican archives? It's not about secrets being kept. It's about the nature of knowledge itself and how we must pursue the truth in the 21st century. There are two crucial lessons we must absorb from the revelations locked within those vaults. The first lesson is a direct refutation of historical despair. The knowledge from the Library of Alexandria didn't vanish. The advancements of the Dark Ages weren't erased. They were simply gathered, protected, and monopolized by the most stable, enduring institution of the time, the Church. This realization forces us to stop believing in the concept of lost history. History is rarely lost. It is merely siloed. It is transferred into a secure, often inaccessible container, a powerful church, an isolated monastery, a competing empire's treasury, or today, perhaps a closed-off government server. Our work as historians and curious individuals is to recognize that we must become global, digital detectives. We cannot afford to look for answers only in the places we expect. In Western European university libraries, we have to look at the Vatican, yes, but also at the libraries of the Middle East, the ancient repositories in China, the overlooked tribal records, and the newly digitized collections in every corner of the world. The key insight is this. A single line in a Syriac manuscript in the Vatican referencing a lost text might lead you to a partial copy of that same text in a library in Istanbul, or a Coptic translation fragment in Cairo. The future of the past lies in cross-referencing global historical silos. We must use modern technology to knit together the fragments of knowledge that institutions like the Vatican have accidentally protected for 1,000 years. The goal isn't to find the one single truth, but to use the connectivity of the modern world to piece together the global tapestry of knowledge that the chaos of the ancient world tore apart. The second, and perhaps most uncomfortable lesson is about power. The Vatican archives teach us that the most powerful institution on earth was not just a keeper of secrets, but a curator of narratives. They intentionally highlighted the texts that supported their authority, like papal bulls, and allowed the texts that complicated their narrative, like pagan syncretism or early scientific discoveries, to simply sit uncatalogued and unread for centuries. This is a lesson for today. We live in an age of monumental data. Corporations, governments, and social media platforms are today's mega archivists. They decide what information is algorithmically prioritized, what is saved, and what is deleted. The archives teach us to adopt a fundamental principle: question the archivist. Ask not just, is this document true, but Why was this document kept, and what document was not kept? What narrative does the entity holding the records want me to believe? The renaming of the archives from secret to apostolic was a nice gesture, but the power remains. The true secret is not in the documents themselves, but in the power to choose which documents are brought into the light. We must use the lessons of this monumental vault to inspire a new generation of researchers. The history you seek is not lost. It's waiting for you to find it, hidden in plain sight, behind the walls of power, in the silent aisles of the world's greatest repositories. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey.